Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you. And a warm welcome to the afternoon show. I'm Bill Arnold. Did you know that gas stations nowadays are sort of becoming places where you can buy drugs? I'm not saying that they're under the counter, they're on the counter. And that's what our topic of conversation is today with Dr. Holly Geyer. She's an associate professor of medicine and dual board certified in internal medicine and addiction medicine. She serves as the physician lead of the opioid stewardship program at the Mayo Clinic in Arizona. Holly, it's so nice to have you back on the show. Thanks for taking time today.
Bill, thanks so much for the opportunity. And I'll tell the audience, that's a lot of titles. They're all boring. The one I'm talking from today is as a mom. And this topic scares the heck out of me.
Yeah. I sometimes when I'm at a gas station and I'm just looking over the counter and I see all this stuff that I think, well, truck drivers have traditionally always wanted little stimulants or people who are on long-distance trips, but the rules have changed and the drugs have changed, haven't they?
Oh, dramatically, and especially over the last 5 to 10-ish years, as we've seen a lot of these novel agents come to market. It's really hard to keep track of, to be honest.
Well, so let's get started. I mean, I want to find out what some of these drugs are and how do we recognize them and how dangerous are they and what do we need to know as moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas?
Bill, I think probably one of the easiest ways to start is with the history of convenience stores, right?
Okay.
Gas stations. We all stop at these. And just like you said, we've seen this morphosis over the last handful of years to more and more agents being available to us right over the counter. Now, we recognize gas stations, convenience stores have sold controlled substances like tobacco, right? Like alcohol, which are specific to age populations for years. And then we started seeing the sneaking of really non-controlled substances, but things that could be toxic and higher profiles hit the market. So I remember going down probably a decade ago, and there were versions of caffeine that'll keep you awake till 2027, right? and there's stuff you can take in novel formats as opposed to just oral. And this stuff was sitting on the edge of the counter as you're checking out your soda, right? It's easy to access, and for most of it, because technically it's not illegal, illicit, or federally controlled, anybody could buy it. We all use the gas station. Everybody owns a car, and as the time frames went on, more and more of these convenience stores recognized the huge potential to bring other novel controlled substances that aren't necessarily recognized as such in the United States, but potentially other countries, onto the counter shelves. And this is exactly what we're seeing today.
Now, Holly, I'm not saying that gas station owners, that is their profit center, is the store. They can get you to come in and buy stuff. So they're probably going to be looking for as many profitability items as possible. And these new wave of drugs are making their way front and center.
It's true, Bill. The big ones I think we'll talk about today are kratom, the Delta-8 cannabises, and something called tianeptine. All of these are not only accessible through the pharmaceutical market that we're talking about, the stuff over the counter at gas stations, convenience stores, but also on the internet. And not necessarily just the darknet. Our kids have access to these with a couple of clicks of the button.
Holly, I was just looking at kratom, and I was looking at some of the effects and some of the ways in which it's abused, and I got real scared real fast.
As you should be.
Okay.
So we'll disclose this right off the bat. I am in Arizona. I grew up in Minnesota. And so I sent my parents out on a little escapade to look up which of these drugs they were able to find in the stores. And 2 of the 3 we're going to be talking about were easily accessed in many convenience stores across Minnesota, which I think is a good portion of our listening audience. Kratom being one of them. It is legal in the state of Minnesota if you're over age 18. And that's a big concern considering it's both a stimulant and an opioid, or at least has those properties.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Holly Geyer is my guest. She's the Associate Professor of Medicine and Addiction Medicine. She's brilliant, and we're talking about these over-the-counter items you can get in gas stations. I mean, in a way, you can get pretty serious addictive drugs going into a gas station, and who knew? So, Holly, as we continue, I just want to remind you, although we are broadcasting out of Minnesota, in St. Paul, Minnesota, we are all over the country. So I have a feeling these items are in convenience and stores and gas stations all over the country.
I'm glad to hear it, Bill, because I'll tell you, when it comes to kratom, my understanding is only 6 states have outlawed it.
Okay.
Now, if we think about stimulants, right? Stimulants are medications we often use to keep people awake if they have sleep disorders or in individuals that struggle with ADHD. They are federally regulated controlled substances. Other examples of stimulants that are not through the pharmaceutical line of chain are cocaine and amphetamines, and we all know the toxicity profile of them. So imagine a drug that's got stimulant-like properties, and then you combine it with the other half of its profile, which is opioid-like properties. In fact, this thing binds to the same receptors as all other opioids do, the mu opioid receptor. And this can lead to sedation, to confusion, to euphoria. It's got a pretty significant profile of all of these concerning features, and yet it doesn't have a lot of regulation. And this is something you can buy right over the internet today with virtually no oversight. Your kids have access.
Yeah. Holly, let's talk a little bit about kratom. It is a tropical tree native to Southeast Asia. So consumption of its leaves produces a stimulant effect and a sedative effect, and can also lead to psychotic symptoms and psychological and physiological dependence. That sounds very dangerous. Let's talk more about this kratom.
It's scary. In fact, I've personally seen the side effects, even in third parties that are in a room where it's being smoked. More often than not, when we see this drug used, it's used in 2 populations. The data shows it's either pretty well-educated white adults in that 30 to 50 age frame, or individuals who are struggling with chronic medical conditions, including addiction. In fact, it's well known in the addiction community for people who struggle with opioid use disorder as an attempt or a way to get off the opioids.
Wow.
Now, the problem is when you substitute one drug for another, you haven't solved anything. And we see a large number of people who transition to this only to become dependent on kratom itself.
Mm-hmm. And Holly, as I was looking at some of the side effects of kratom, I'm seeing things like, and stop me if I'm wrong, but nausea, sweating, tachycardia, vomiting, drowsiness, and loss of appetite. This, again, also you can experience insomnia, seizure, and hallucinations.
You named it. That's exactly what we start seeing. So in lower doses, it really doesn't have too bad of a toxicity profile, although it does run the risk of dependence. The problem is, as a non-controlled, non-pharmaceutically produced substance, you have no idea what your dose is in each, grouping of medications or substances that you're taking in. You have no idea if it was produced in a sanitary environment, and you certainly can't control the dose yourself as to how much you're using, which greatly increases the risk of overdose and lethality, both of which have been observed.
Holly, one of the things you said that makes me extra nervous, too, is that the kratom will attach themselves to the same part of a nerve cell as some of the opioids will. So it could actually mimic an opioid, couldn't it?
Exactly. Yep. Because it's got such a unique profile, I don't think it's been listed as an opioid, but certainly has synergistic properties at that receptor that would do the same thing as any other opioid would.
And clearly something like this could be addictive, and your kids or grandkids could be going into gas stations and buying this, and we have no idea that they could be getting hooked on this, and nor do they.
So I will say, when I sent my poor parents in to attempt to purchase it, of course they had no real intent, but they were carded.
They were carded?
That's probably the most positive thing I could say about that drug right now, but there is no carding that takes place when you buy it on the internet, and it is widely available just about everywhere. I think what parents need to know is that it comes through a lot of different names. Keep an eye out for that because you're going to be looking for the specific substance itself, kratom,
Mm-hmm.
as the potential, toxic component.
Yeah. Now, Holly, is there any benefits to speak of? I mean, can kratom used to treat pain in a constructive way, or is this that we're talking about this gas station medication just too unregulated and too dangerous? Is there any benefit to this before we villainize it completely?
In its current form, I wouldn't touch it with a 1,000-foot
Okay.
pole. Now, that being said, we're a capitalist nation, right? Anytime there's value to a drug or a plant product, pharmaceutical companies are going to pick it up. They're going to study it in clinical trials. They're going to take away the risks, right, in dosing parameters and use it in the right populations to identify how and when it can best be used for patient gain as well as for potential profit. We're not there yet. I will say there's a lot of preclinical studies that have attempted to integrate it in a variety of things. We've looked at it in Alzheimer's disease. We've looked at it as an anti-diabetic medication. They've tried it in alcohol use disorder, and they've tried it for people with cognitive performance problems. And there's some early successes with this. So if we as society can wait out the clinical studies, if and when it makes it to market, it's going to be used in the right way in the right person for the right reasons to offer benefit.
So, Holly, if you go into a gas station and you purchase some of this kratom, are they calling it how are they defining it in the store? Is it a supplement? Is it this will help you stay awake on the road? This will help you be more alert? How are they advertising it?
Good question. I've seen one of everything. You're going to see it as a sedative in many
Oh,
locations because it is a sedative, right? It's
okay.
got that opioid property. You're going to see it as a pain reliever. They're not wrong. And you're going to see it as a stimulant to keep you awake. It does one of everything because it binds to multiple receptors. It's going to come in a variety of forms. You're going to see capsules and resins. It's got tinctures and powders. And so this is one of the more heterogeneous formats that the drugs with potential for abuse can be offered in out in general public.
Mm-hmm. And as a doctor, an addiction doctor, you wouldn't touch this with a 1,000-foot pole.
That's a very short line.
Okay, so it'd actually be a longer pole than that.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah, this
all right.
scares me.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty helpful to know because if they're in gas stations across the country and only 6 states have outlawed it, there is a chance that kids are going to get their hands on this and they can abuse it quickly and they can get in trouble. So thank you for that. Let's talk about Delta 8 cannabis.
Delta 8 cannabis.
Isn't
We thought our problems were bad. Wait till you see our solutions as society, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is legal in Minnesota. And it's primarily legal as regulated under all other forms of cannabis. Delta 9 being the most common one all of us are familiar with, which is THC. So yes, you can get this one in Minnesota too, along with many states across the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Let me know more about this Delta 8 and why is this so dangerous? I mean, what I've read with the use of cannabis right now is that the cannabis of today is not the cannabis that was brought into culture in the 70s when I was in high school. I never tried it ever, but I certainly knew friends that were using it. But it's a very different day today, isn't it, with cannabis?
Oh, it's changed quite a bit. We've seen so many increases in not just usage patterns amongst our youth, in adults, especially with widespread availability and legalization. But on top of that, the potency of the drug itself has changed. We were seeing potency levels around 25% of the most vasoactive, psychoactive components to this drug, upwards of 70 to 80% in most available plants right now. So what toxicities we saw before, in some populations are now widespread.
All right. So cannabis is growing in such popularity, and there are cannabis stores all over. If people have trouble sleeping or if they have trouble with some pain management, are one of these shops something that you could find a product that would give you some relief, or is that again something you're warning against?
Absolutely a warning against this
Okay.
drug.
Oh,
So most of us are familiar with the concept of the Delta 9 or THC cannabis.
yep.
And most states across the nation, that's the one everyone talks about as being the regulated one, the one we're scared about. But what we don't understand is that that cannabis plant, right, the marijuana plant, has hundreds of psychoactive components to it. And THC is recognized as probably the most potent of those, the most psychoactive. But Delta 8 is a different variation of it. It's called an isomer, something you stare in front of a mirror and your left is now right and your right is now left. That's what Delta 8 is. And so it binds to the receptors a little bit differently, but still has psychoactive effects. The problem is when the Farm Bill came out in 2018, virtually everything outside of THC now fell into this whole category of being considered hemp. That included Delta 8. And so Delta 8 became widespread across the United States as something that, quote, isn't cannabis, right? It isn't THC. And what we saw was dramatic rises in usage rates, even though it's got toxicity profiles that are scary and high potential for addiction.
Dr. Holly Geyer is my guest. She is the Associate Professor of Medicine. She's also a dual board certified in internal medicine and addiction medicine. So we've come to the right person to talk about this topic. Gas station drugs and other things that are emerging all over the country. We're going to take a little break and be right back with Holly. Hi, it's Bill Arnold, host of the afternoon show. Revelation chapter 5 tells us our prayers are stored in bowls of gold in heaven. And when we pray, it is like a sweet-smelling aroma to the Lord. All to say, our prayers are precious to God. And we wonder sometimes if God is hearing our prayers and if he cares. Well, the answer to those two questions are yes and yes. Start by praising him, by reading his word, by submitting to him in prayer, and he will bring you peace and comfort. Connecting faith to life, Faith Radio. Pretty appropriate song, White, to get back into this conversation.
Yeah?
I have to admit, yeah. Everybody's kind of, their hearts are racing a little bit. Talking about these stimulants and some of these chemicals you can pick up at gas stations, and you think they appear innocent, but they are not. Holly Geyer is my guest. She is the Associate Professor of Medicine and dual board certified, so she's really smart on this topic. Really glad to have her on. And Holly, let's talk about tianeptine. Did I say that right?
Tianeptine, very close.
Tianeptine. Okay, I feel more qualified now to discuss this. I don't even know what it is.
You got it. It's very close. We don't hear a lot about this. It's also known as gas station heroin or Zaza. Or if you've been watching the news over the last year or so, Neptune's Fix, Neptune's Elixir, it's one of the more popular brands. That one got called under federal regulation. So it's an emerging drug. It is widely accessible across the United States, and it's getting us in trouble.
You just used the words gas station heroin. That was really scary.
It terrifies all of us. Yeah. There's a handful of states, including Minnesota, have outlawed this drug completely. It's considered a controlled substance, a Schedule I, which means it has no medicinal value. And I don't blame the state government for doing that. There's a lot of push to get that regulated at the same level federally. If you look at what the drug is itself, it's an approved antidepressant in a number of other countries. When we think about antidepressants, we in the United States, we've got a lot of options, right? We've got the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or SSRIs or SNRIs, SMS. What we've got here, tianeptine, it's called a tricyclic antidepressant. And it's a little bit strange morphology because when it works at higher levels, it becomes a full binder to that new opioid receptor. Now, you remember that from our other drug of abuse there, we talked about the kratom. Mm-hmm. It's opioid at high enough doses. And you can only imagine what the toxicities are going to be when people are using it at that level.
What does that drug do to you? And tell me more about why that would be used.
So at its approved doses in other countries, which is somewhere around that 25 to 50 milligram time dose frame, what it should be doing is it's, typical anti-anxiety properties, antidepressant properties. They've got some good data on it at that doses, right? But when it's used in an unregulated format, which is how it's been available in the United States, what we're seeing are doses upwards of 3,000 milligrams. And that's easy to overdose on. It doesn't take near that much to start getting that binding of the mu opioid receptor and starting to lead to overdoses, huge toxicity profiles, even deaths.
Mm-hmm. Holly, when you start to mix these drugs that you can buy in a gas station with other things like alcohol of any kind, what would be the possible outcome of that mixture?
Ask the morgue.
Oh,
This
wow.
is what's going to happen.
Wow.
They actually looked at what's been going on with this drug profile, and they identified on this Reddit forum, someone went through and evaluated, just when and why people are using this. The vast majority of people who are ingesting this are poly drug users, meaning tianeptine is just one on the list that they're using. And they think it as an opioid, right? But much easier to access and probably with less toxicity than fentanyl, because that's a pretty quick fatality without knowing the dose in that. But they looked back and there were more than 1,100 human exposures between 2019 and 2023, nearly 400 in 2023. So the cases are going up every year, and it looks just like an opioid overdose when it happens.
Mm-hmm. Holly, if kids or grandkids, you're around them and you suspect that there's something off, how and when can you expect that kids might be using these over-the-counter drugs that you'd buy at a gas station?
Every drug here that we've talked about is going to lead to a form of intoxication and or addiction and or withdrawal. So those are the three big things that every parent's going to want to look for. As you know, from an intoxication standpoint, it depends on the drug. Some of these are sedatives. So if your kid's sleepy, if they're not as responsive, if they're not doing their homework as expected, or right, their handwriting's changing, light bulbs should go on. Same thing goes for these drugs with stimulant-like properties, right? So if they're super energetic, if they can't focus, if their personality is changing, high energy, all again reasons to start having some hard conversations. And then when we think about the withdrawal symptoms, you essentially reverse the pattern of intoxication for most withdrawal symptoms. So if you had a high, then someone's going to be in a very low. They're depressed. They have low energy. They just don't pay attention as usual. And when it comes to dependency, we think about the big 4 C's for that. So problems with cravings, problems with control, problems with compulsion, and problems with consequences. If you know your kids are using these or you have concerns and any of those 4 C's are met, those are great reasons to bring your kids in with a pediatrician and have a very open, honest conversation. One thing I would tell all parents, it can be really tough taking your 12, 13, 14-year-old and that pediatrician's going to ask to have a private conversation. Please let them do it. You wouldn't believe how honest these kids oftentimes get in those discussions that they'll never have with you. So take the risk. You might get tremendous benefits out of it.
Wow, that's great advice. Dr. Holly Geyer is my guest. All right, Holly, how do we protect kids from these? Because if you can go into a gas station and get these drugs, you've got a pretty good chance you can get your hands on it. Or do you order them off the internet, or both? Or how do we protect kids?
Absolutely both. Yep, it's going to be an engaged parent that's going to notice this stuff early and probably be the one to have these proactive conversations about these drugs even out there. I'll tell you one thing, many kids aren't going to know, right? If you can buy it over the counter at the gas station and that gas station isn't checking ID, then how is that kid not going to know that this isn't another, higher form of caffeine? It's all going with goofy names.
Yeah.
So educate. I would highly recommend every parent say, listen, we want to know what you're taking, right? Any stimulant you purchase, and this includes internet or over the counter, needs to be run by us first. And then, number 2, talk about these 3 drugs because these are the big ones hitting the market. And we're going to have another conversation, Bill, I bet in another year to 2 years, because it'll be a flood of new ones that are hitting. The situation's evolving.
Holly, what about adults? I know we've been focusing on the younger crowd because they can ride their bikes up to the gas station and get a Mountain Dew and some of these pills, and all of a sudden they're talking being a drug user right there. They may know it or not know it, but they're interested in this stuff.
Oh,
What about
number one,
what about adults?
great question, Bill. I mean, what I would tell adults, just because it's accessible doesn't make it safe. We live in a very free world in the United States, and all the benefits that we have of it come with the potential for risks. When it comes to accessing non-controlled substances that have danger profiles, it's here in 2024. And so before you make the assumption that something is safe, just like Delta 8 cannabis, which fits into this loophole, right? It's got toxicity profiles, but it's not technically THC. Do your research and do your homework beforehand. And don't go to the industry sponsoring the benefits of these drugs to get your answers. There's a lot of medical information out there. So start with going to medical resources, right? WebMD is a great example. There's a bunch others out there. Do your homework before you put it in your mouth.
Holly, when you talk about unregulation, so there must be some things that show up in these pills. Would it be heavy metals or bacteria? What would be showing up in these pills?
Oh, you name it. We've seen one of everything. Yes, so bacteria have been identified, toxic doses of substances. We've recognized heavy metals, contaminants, pollutants, as well as other pharmaceuticals. The process of making these is not standardized. This is not done on a hood, with people wearing white clothes in a sanitary environment. A lot of these are mom and pop produced.
Wow.
And with no federal regulation, you don't know what you're getting.
Yeah, they're like working out of their garage, filling these capsules. What are they doing? It's just
Pretty
terrible.
much.
Yeah.
Anything to make a dime.
Yeah. All right. We're going to take a little break. We're talking to Dr. Holly Geyer, and we're talking about drugs that you can buy at a gas station. So they're pretty accessible. You don't need to be carded. You can just buy these, and they are bad news. All right. If you have a loved one that is, kind of in trouble, maybe they're far from God, and that's weighing on your heart as well. Just so you know, we're walking through that with you. God sees you, and he knows the heartache that you feel. And at Faith Radio, we see that too. So you can text the word heart to 877-933-2484, and we'll text you some audio messages to encourage you as you go through this journey of prayer and patience. And again, you can just text one word, just the word heart, to 877-933-2484. And we'll take a little tiny break, and when we come back, we'll be continuing our discussion with Dr. Holly Geyer.
It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold. Prime time, drive time. Let's get it started. Jump in your car. Yeah. What's for dinner? Hey. It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold.
My guest today is Dr. Holly Geyer. She is an associate professor of medicine. She's down at the Mayo Clinic in Arizona, and we're just so glad to have her on. She is an addiction medicine expert as well. We've been talking about these crazy over-the-counter drugs you can buy at gas stations and buy off the internet, and they're really bad, so we need to pay attention to it. They are no good, just so you know. Now, because I have Holly on the phone, I want to continue to talk a little bit about the opioid overdose epidemic, because I think we got some time for this, Holly, if you don't mind. Help us further understand this, because there's so many people dying from this right now.
Boy, every year we have the same conversation. How do we get out of this? And I think we recycle a lot of options, but I will tell you, Bill, we continue to head in the wrong direction. Last year, there were more than 110,000 deaths related to overdoses. Somewhere between 70 to 80% of those were related to synthetic opioids.
So are people getting addicted to them? They're innocently? Are they coming off a minor surgery or a surgery of some kind, and they have enough for 3 or 4 days, but then they say, I really liked how this felt, I want to get more, and the doctor prescribes more? How does this work?
Yeah, I will say if we were to summarize how people go to opioids and why,
Yeah.
there's really three main profiles of people that we see navigating that direction. The first one is the one that led to the opioid epidemic. This is patients coming to us with legitimate medical complaints, and we as providers are offering opioids, but not necessarily screening them for risk factors for opiate addiction. Or overdose for that matter, monitoring them closely while they're on the opioids. We offer, refills unscrupulously. We're not pairing opioids with other non-opioid therapies. And over time, typically weeks to months, that brain starts to change. And these are people that are living perfectly normal lives, right? Happy people. They're not depressed. They weren't sexually abused for 20 years, right? And mental health alleviation, is their go-to, right? They're normal people. And over time, the brain rewires and they develop in this pattern of a substance use disorder, or opioid use disorder that starts to control their lives. That's a mess. That's still what we see today. It's a big issue. I will say numbers are better. In fact, over a 10-year period within the last 15 years, we saw a 50% decrease in the total number of opioid prescriptions written across the US. But, as we talked about at the beginning, overdose numbers are just skyrocketing. And that's because of these other two potential pathways. The next one I talk about is the recreational pathway. So this is what we think about when we think about our kids using drugs. People who use the recreational pathway use these opioids for the high, for their entertainment feature, to be socially accepted. We're seeing a lot of that. In fact, we look back in 2013, 80% of people that were using heroin, because there was no fentanyl, had started off with a prescription opioid. Right now, that number is down to about 30 or 40%. So this is de novo use for entertainment value or other reasons in 70+% of people that are now struggling with opioid addiction. And then when we look at that third pathway, this is the one that hit us so hard with COVID. That was the mental health alleviation pathway. I'll tell you, opioids are amazing sedatives. They are amazing mental health alleviators. If you have depression, you have anxiety, this stuff melts it away early on until it becomes the problem. And for so many people, they often kind of merge into that chronic dependency pathway and then ultimately into the lifestyle of addiction. So three main.
So, Holly, great reminder right now that if you have in your medicine cabinet at home a bottle of some opioids, put it somewhere safe or maybe even lock it up, because you don't want anyone coming in and slowly stealing from that pill box.
It scares me.
Mm-hmm.
It is a federally controlled substance. Any person accessing it outside of you, if you're the patient, that's considered diversion. That is illegal. And on top of that, it kills. If not used in the right person for the right indication at the right dose and the right length of treatment, the toxicity profile outweighs the benefits in most circumstances. So this is why it's so key, like you're saying, Bill, lock this stuff up.
Mm-hmm.
Keep it so no one can access it until the right time and place. If you're being monitored by a third party, right, your spouse has concerns with you using it, make sure that you witness her opening it and she witnesses you opening it. Keep each other accountable. And when you're done with the drug, get it out of the house. Don't wait for the next do-it-yourself project.
Amen to that, Holly. So if you have some pain and you've got, you're just so desperate to get some relief, what's a more natural homeopathic way to deal with pain? Is that inflammation? Is it something you can do through your diet? Is there something you can do proactively versus reaching for an opioid?
Great question, Bill. Considering we're speaking mostly to Americans, as I understand it, I will say in America, we have a pain problem. Our willingness to live with pain and let it do its job is a very challenging mindset for us to adapt. And that's why more than 80% of the world's prescription opioids are used by Americans. I'll tell you, across the rest of the world, they figured out that pain serves a purpose, at least in its acute phase, right? It sets limitations. It lets your body heal. So the first thing I'd say is if you're experiencing pain and you're reaching towards that opioid, maybe your body's saying, listen, you just had surgery. Take it easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe consider an alternative like heat or ice or relaxation. I will tell you one thing, Bill, in 2024, there is virtually no role outside of advanced active cancer pain or end-of-life pain to be using an opioid as monotherapy, meaning the only thing you're taking or using for pain. We always want to combine these drugs with alternatives, and that includes something like scheduled acetaminophen or Tylenol with breakthrough ibuprofen. Most cases, opioids should be our last resort drug, not our go-to drug.
Okay, I appreciate that. Dr. Holly Geyer is my guest. Holly, talk about fentanyl. Is that a synthetic narcotic? Do you make that in a laboratory? How does that come about?
My field makes it in a laboratory, but that's not where most people get it. So yes, fentanyl is called an opioid. It is not from the original poppy plant, which is opiates, which means unlike morphine or heroin, this stuff is completely built through other chemicals that combine, and then ultimately, when you use it, binds to those opioid receptors. It is a powerful, powerful pain reliever, easy to make, dirt cheap for all the ingredients, very limited need to transport it, right? Because if you don't have to grow it in a third country, it makes it a whole lot easier, especially for the illicit market, to produce. We use it in the inpatient field in very tiny doses to manage pain relief and for surgeries, procedures. The illicit world is it widespread, open for its euphoric effects, its ability to induce that high, and it's very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. What do we do for overdose prevention strategy?
Boy, so if we're talking about the pharmaceutical world, which is where I live, we should be screening patients for baseline comorbidities that'll put them at risk for an overdose. So those are people who are typically over age 65, people with baseline heart or lung problems, people with kidney or liver problems because they may not process drugs well in the opioid class, and then anyone with a prior history of an overdose. We as providers should be asking every patient about those before we offer an opioid. Now, in the illicit market, what you need to understand is that when your dealer, when whoever's offering you these opioids says this is, cocaine, right? This is cannabis, you name it. There is no guarantee that that drug is not laced with a lethal dose of fentanyl.
Wow.
Here in Arizona, more than 50% of the U.S. fentanyl comes straight through our borders to the rest of the U.S. And of those 50% that's confiscated here, 7 out of 10 pills has enough in one pill of fentanyl to kill the average American adult. It's just 2 milligrams. So it doesn't take much, and you never know how much you're getting. Dangerous.
Oh, what you just said, Holly, is so horrifying. There's that much of that in the country right now, just coming pouring in, huh?
Oh, goodness. The numbers go up astronomically every year. I remember talking to a DEA agent. So they said, a couple of years ago when we confiscated 100 pounds of drugs, I mean, that made the newspapers. Now that's Tuesday, right?
Yeah.
This is everywhere, and it's coming in droves. And I would say the cartels are a highly orchestrated business venture. They map things out. They know who knows where. They've got their routes ready to go. It's a great business plan that kills the customer base.
Yeah, I'm sure they're very well organized. Dr. Holly Geyer is my guest. She's an associate professor of medicine and dual board certified in internal medicine and addiction medicine. So we have come to the right source talking about this topic. We're going to take a little break, and we'll be right back with Holly. Hi, podcast listener. I'm Bill Arnold, and my theme song says, "What's for dinner?" And like when I'm grilling, I'm paying really close attention. And I know that ideal second to get the food off the grill. Like all good and ideal timings in life, right now would be an ideal time to be a cheerful giver to Faith Radio. Give now to support this podcast so that more people in more places might come to saving faith in Jesus and grow in their relationship and become a fully devoted follower. Click the link in the show notes or give now at myfaithradio.com. Welcome back to the show. Dr. Holly Geyer is my guest. She's written an amazing book called Ending the Crisis, Mayo Clinic's Guide to Opioid Addiction and Safe Opioid Use. So definitely check that out. All right, Holly, do you have, given as we look at the current state of this crisis, does anything give you hope?
I think people's mentality is changing, and it needs to. In America, we have a very low threshold to turn to pharmacotherapies for our solutions. You name the ailment, and we use drugs for it. And I will say in the medical community, we are as guilty as they come for oftentimes going to that, select drug class to offer what we think as, the right answer, when in fact, the real right answer might be looking holistically at our overall lifestyles and all the contributors from stress to social factors that really seem to drive the medical issues. I think people are wising up to that, and that's key. So looking at our lifestyle holistically, daily exercise, finding the joy in, our faith, our spirituality, in our families, in our relationships. This is a good way to reapproach all of the issues we seem to have that stack up and drive us to drugs.
Mm-hmm. Holly, are some of the pharmaceutical companies at fault for being so persuasive to tell doctors to encourage people to use these pharmaceuticals? You always say follow the money. Does that apply in this situation?
Oh, goodness. Many of them are out there. They produce great drugs, but they've also got to recoup on all the financing, which could be millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars
Mm-hmm.
to produce that drug. And that can lead to a degree of aggressiveness, shall we call it,
Mm-hmm.
that sometimes doesn't necessarily benefit the patients or the providers. The federal government did step in, especially coming out of this opioid crisis, to set limits on how easy it is for those drug companies to access the physicians that write the prescription. But the drug companies wisened up and they go straight to the patient now. You can't turn on the TV after 8 p.m. and not see, a new drug that cures X, Y, or Z. I
That's
would
so
say
true.
ask your provider. It's not going to hurt to have these conversations because oftentimes we don't think about them, but put them in the whole plan of care that looks at your whole life. What other adjunctive agents that are non-medications that might be beneficial as well? Ask about them.
Mm-hmm. All right, Holly, we've talked about the gas station drugs, which was shocking in the first half hour of the show. And I just want to let anyone know, if you missed this hour with Dr. Holly Geyer, you do want to check out the beginning of it and listen to the whole podcast, because there's been some pretty startling information on drugs you can buy at a gas station, which means your kids and grandkids can be buying these drugs at a gas station, and also the opioid crisis and the current state of that. But let's talk some final thoughts on all of this, because the whole topic is so enormous.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I think our listener base wants out of this crisis as well as I do. The younger generations are the ones that are forming their brains, and they are so, so susceptible in early stages of development to long-term rewiring. There's been a number of studies that look at this rewiring in the brain, and it persists upwards of 15 years in some people. It may be longer. We just don't have a lot of clinical data. And so I would say the earliest you can intervene on any developing drug habit, the better off you will be, that patient will be, your family will be. Be bold and speak up when it comes to your kids. You can't afford to do nothing, especially in the world of the fentanyl epidemic, where it's lacing just about everything.
Mm-hmm. So in your book, Ending the Crisis, Mayo Clinic's Guide to Opioid Addiction and Safe Opioid Use, you've got some incredible stories in this book. Would you mind sharing one with our listeners?
Yeah, I think the one that broke my heart the most was one of my co-writers. I paired up with two amazing patient education writers, one of which was named Mary Curtis. And she was very open at the beginning of the book, sharing the story about her mom. As her mom struggled for years with chronic pain syndrome and ultimately ended up in the hospital setting for what they thought was a constipation issue. The family started to realize that she actually had an opioid problem, and these opioids were stored in every drawer in the house and every medicine cabinet and up and down, and the family just didn't know. That constipation had become so bad that it perforated her bowels, and she died. My patient education writer lost her mom to the opioid crisis.
Wow.
And it was preventable. So, boy, I would tell every listener the toxicity profile that we talked about today for these drugs is just one of many that we didn't have time to discuss. There are so many reasons to use these drugs wisely and get them right when they're prescribed, and to stay away 1,000 plus miles if they're off the illicit market.
Holly, there has been, not only since COVID, but there has been obviously an epidemic of loneliness, and people are more withdrawn. They're probably more inclined to use drugs just to numb some of their feelings, some of their, you talk about, recreational use, but also pain use. But I think there's also that use of of could be drugs, could be alcohol, where you're just trying to get away from your feelings of loneliness and isolation.
Boy, it's so true, Bill. We look back at the opioid crisis, and the drugs that we promised to kill pain are now killing us. You could say that about every drug that's hit the market, cannabis being one of them. We recognize that early use of virtually all of these has benefits.
Mm-hmm.
We're not wrong about that, right? You get euphoria, they alleviate our mental health concerns, and then they own you. It is not if, it's when, for many, if not most, drugs of abuse.
Mm.
And the assumption that you can control it. I grew up in the drug treatment field, Bill. I've seen senators' kids. I've seen doctors' kids. You don't have to be, someone who's lived on the streets with 20 years of some kind of a social impairment to be susceptible to this. It is anyone, and you cannot control them, because the way they work is by controlling the part of you that controls you, that frontal lobe.
Mm-hmm. And Holly, I say this with all respect. You grew up around drug addicts. I'm not talking about your family. I'm talking about what your family's ministry was. Do share that.
Absolutely. Yeah. My parents had started the program Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge when I was a little kid. And I grew up in that environment. My dad was not shy about dragging me down there when we had that first house on Clinton Street. And
Mm-hmm.
I was immersed in the world. I have heard every story. We went to churches on Sunday where our clients would present. And I'll tell you what, at some point, something switches in your mind to just being empathetic, to being proactive. And that's what happened to me. I am done hearing stories, Bill. I am done watching overdoses. And I am absolutely committed to being a part of the solution. So I know there's parents out there equally as aggressive to end this. Let this be the last generation. If you're part of that listening audience, I would say be proactive at a government level, at a local community level, with local treatment programs, and especially in your faith community.
Mm-hmm. What if I have a loved one in the grips of an addiction right now and I don't know what to do? Of course, I'm praying round the clock, but what other proactive step can I take, Holly Geyer?
I would refer people back to my book if it's on the topic of opioids. In fact, the whole latter section of that book is what to do as a family member if someone's struggling with opioid addiction. What we go into there is applicable to other drugs of abuse, because we talk about the biopsychosocial spiritual treatment paradigm. And I will say, Bill, this is something missing in so many treatment programs. The number one thing I'd want our audience to know today is that abstinence is not recovery. And abstinence as a concept, meaning just not actively using that drug of abuse or a different one, is not being a family member. It's not being a citizen or a taxpayer or a dad, right? We want to get the whole person back. And so, a good example being opioid use disorder. We put people on methadone or buprenorphine. And although these drugs can have tremendous benefit in the right person, in the right setting, that in itself is not going to get you that person back. So when you're looking for a treatment program, make sure that they're implementing the whole continuum of care, not just any potential therapeutic medications, but also the counseling sessions. Amazing data on rewiring of the brain with cognitive behavioral interviewing and motivational interviewing. It's fascinating. Same thing for addressing all the social issues, right? So the homelessness, food security, getting your kids back, if they're, in the foster care system, that's all got to be addressed. And then, of course, spirituality. The data shows 84% of clients that enter a treatment program are looking for some form of spirituality integrated in, because this is the only way that we find purpose, hope, and forgiveness and peace. So find that treatment program that offers it all, and there is your best chance at recovery.
That's so well said, Holly. And I can't imagine coming to sobriety and finding purpose and meaning in life without Christ. I mean, I've seen people who've been able to get sober, but they're just white knuckling it seems, the rest of their life.
Boy, it's what makes us whole, I tell you.
Yeah. Well, I so appreciate you spending time with us today and giving us a heads up on some of these gas station drugs. Now, I never look at that stuff, Holly, when I go into gas stations, so I feel fairly removed from this stuff. I don't do long over the road trips. I don't, I'll have a cup of coffee if I start to get tired, but I would never consider reaching out for those. But I'm amazed that they're available and they're so dangerous.
Well, you go talk to my parents and they'll tell you where to get them.
I think I will. I'll call Rich and find out. Thank you so much, Holly. I appreciate, again, you coming on the show. Been a delight.
Such a pleasure to be with you, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Holly Geyer has been my guest, and I'll give you the name of her book one more time. It's called Ending the Crisis, Mayo Clinic's Guide to Opioid Addiction and Safe Opioid Use. That's all the time we have. Have a great night, everyone. See you tomorrow. Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.